excited to be moderating this awesome panel that we have today. And what we're going to be focused on is where to find alternative data, when to use it, and I'm going to tack on how to use it as well, because we have some people with machine learning backgrounds today on this panel, and I want to make the most of that. So I'll quickly introduce who we have today. So we have Jean, starting this side, who's the head of data science at BFS Capital. We've got Lloyd, who is director of business development at Inverite. We've got Sol, data science manager at Borrowell, and we've got Tanay, who's co-founder and VP product at Clearbanc. So as Mark said today, alternative data has really come into the spotlight in financial services, and it's really prompted a significant shift in credit availability for the unbanked, the underbanked, or credit invisible consumer, call it as you may. Data has more broadly been seen as a way to also protect these lenders from the risks of better company business lending and allow them to design innovative digital financial products to extend credit to a larger base. So let's start today with Sol. And Sol, I'd like to have you first demystify traditional and alternative data. So let's start with what that means for Borrowell in your business model and some of the special types of alternative data sets that you might be using today.
Yeah, for sure. So I like to think of kind of alternative versus traditional data more as a spectrum or a continuum rather than kind of a strict dichotomy. So on the more traditional side, a lot of the data at Borrowell comes from monthly Equifax credit reports. So when a user signs up for Borrowell, we pull their credit report for free for them every single month. And that gives us a month-over-month view of their trended credit score, trade balances, late payments, that kind of stuff. And then taking a step towards more the alternative side, we've also relied really heavily on behavioral data as a window into somebody's habits and preferences. So you can imagine somebody who kind of checks their rate very frequently on a personal loan, and they have a lot of pre-qualified offers, but they don't really proceed beyond that. From that pattern of behavior, we can kind of infer that this person is maybe more rate sensitive and not super desperate for a loan today. And then on the far end, on the very alternative side, we have bank account transaction data. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff we can glean from this. Like, for instance, how often does somebody eat out versus buy groceries? Or do they have automated savings in place? And there's some really wacky stuff you can try to infer from this. Like, for instance, how many days on average in advance of somebody's trip do they typically book their flight? So I think, as Mark mentioned, on the alternative side of the spectrum, we're really starting to just scratch the surface on the types of interesting features that we can build.
Okay, thanks so much. So that's in the context of an individual and borrower, but I'm going to pass it on to Tanay because your use cases are probably slightly different. You're looking at e-commerce businesses, direct-to-consumer businesses. So how does the realm of alternative data sets versus traditional data sets change for you compared to that?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks a lot, guys. Excited to be here. We'd love to kind of maybe it'll help give you a quick background on what Clearbanc does. So we're the largest funder of e-commerce brands globally. We have close to 3,000 companies in our portfolio, and we've deployed about $1 billion into the market. The only way we're able to do that is because we use sort of primary immutable data from our e-commerce brands, including their 5 sources of data: payment processor data, their e-commerce channels, accounting data, and acquisition data. So the reason why we use these 5 sources of data is essentially to build in some redundancy and get a 360-degree view of the customer. I think that Rebecca brought it up a little while ago in the last panel that you want to have redundant sources of data, so in case one falls off, you have some way to continue understanding, where what the performance of the business looks like, and you're not just tied to one data source. So what we found is banks are traditionally not set up to kind of use these new data sets to be able to underwrite business in a fast and quick and efficient way. So that's why we've been able to scale quite rapidly in this market. But really, we're focused on small business lending, and really the focus here is kind of trust and privacy. How do we, use this data in an unbiased way to get a quick and understanding of the customer, and then deploy capital against that, which they can use to kind of accelerate their growth.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much. Gee, so slightly different use case again, given what you're doing at BFS Capital, almost a combination of what how Borrowell and Clearbanc might be looking at data sets. So if you could tell us a bit about how you're looking at alternative data.
Sure. So a lot of similarities with what Sol and Tanay said already, but We have a fairly simple approach. So we're starting from looking at or moving away from our upfront review of data using bureau data, using the more traditional data sources, and incorporating more real-time, more continuous data. So things like transactional data, cloud accounting data that Mark mentioned earlier, things like that that help us predict cash flow or potentially detect fraud early on. And to supplement this data, we'll also use more alternative data sources. So again, depending on the industry, so let's say you have a seasonal business, then it might make sense to use things like weather data. Or you're a restaurant, so maybe online reviews will be a useful kind of social sentiment analysis will be a useful use case in this case. And in addition, we're building strategic partnerships, and they're on many different levels. And one of those levels is empowering access to more proprietary third-party data.
Thank you so much. All right, so a couple things that were mentioned here then. So we said transaction data, we said cloud accounting data, we said some social sentiment data. Let's talk about the bank account transaction data. It's the big data that's the core of what a lot of you are doing right now. There's a lot of talk about it. You have the Yodleys of the world. For those of you that are familiar, you had the Inverite acquisition of Credit Karma recently, all about these financial data giants. I'm going to flip it to Lloyd, who works for Inverite. They do real-time verification checks. Tell us a little bit about how look-through into transaction data actually works when when a consumer's giving you the go-ahead to access their account transaction details, and how do you process that? How do you clean that? Do you categorization of that? And how do you ultimately fill that into a pipeline to a Clearbanc, a Borrowell, or a BFS Capital?
Great. So really, it's a three-step process. The first stage of the pipeline is really we're going to be pulling in all of the data from our originating source, which is going to be the bank or credit union. There's about 300 of them, and it's obviously very valuable data. The problem is that there's so much of it, and it's so diverse that it's not easy to work with either for a person, or for code. So at the second stage of the process, we're going to map those transactions into actionable insights, and the way we do that is by categorizing the transactions. So what you might see on a statement is say like a transaction with a numbered BC corporation. Well, actually, that's going to be a payday lender. And unless you knew that ahead of time, that's not much use. So we do that. Or maybe an innocent looking in-track transfer is actually a payment to a bankruptcy trustee. So we're going to go through that. We're also going to show you some positives like spending on health and fitness, or regular payment of bills and utilities. We're also going to be able to show you what the customer's income is, and not just how much they're making, the frequency, the source, and also when they've been paid and when they're going to be paid in the future. And then finally, we're going to summarize all that into easy to use statistics. You can just at a glance say, this is how many NSFs they had in the last 180 days, or this is their total income from 365 days. And then the third stage is going to be using all this data for the lender to make a credit decision. Now, maybe they're going to be doing a traditional credit scorecard, or maybe they're feeding it in as inputs into a machine learning model, one that perhaps they've developed in-house, or perhaps a third-party model like our risk score. But either way, the goal is going to be the same. You want consistent, repeatable, and reliable results.
Great, thanks, Lloyd. I actually wanted to kind of ask that question to the rest of the panel as well. You're probably treating it all in different ways, but when you receive transaction data, whether it's coming in from consumers or businesses, it's not standardized, I imagine, by any means, at least from my interaction with this sort of data in the past. How much of load is that on your team? How are you addressing the cleansing, cleaning, mapping, and connectivity of that data to your other data sets, specifically the transaction data? And I guess I'll start with Tanay.
Yeah, so I can echo what Lloyd said. It's not, once you have a connection to a bank account, it's not super obvious what the metadata associated with each transaction is. So that is a non-trivial process as to how you draw insight from the data and the garbage in, garbage out. So if you don't give them the right, you don't get the right kind of metadata associated with the transaction, you get an imperfect understanding of the types of transactions. So totally echo that. A lot of the data sets that we use are immutable and sort of normalized. You can think about it in the sense that when you pull Stripe or Shopify for what an order looks like, it's normalized and it's the same type of transaction every single time. So that makes our lives a little bit easier. But then when you think about accounting systems like QuickBooks, everyone kind of reconciles their accounts a little bit differently. So you want to be able to capture 80% of the value from 20% of how you analyze the data set. So if it's immutable, this is why we kind of like really focus on how do we access payment processor data, business bank account data, is because it's standardized and you cannot alter it even if you wanted to. Whereas things like accounting data might be a little bit, I feel this is how I want to reconcile my accounts at the end of the year, which is different across businesses. So totally echo that sentiment, but there is a significant amount of effort that goes in to clean the data and normalize the data in our systems before it's ready to be used by our models as well.
Okay. So, Gene, do you have anything else to add to that on the transaction-based part?
Yeah, I think I'll take a step back here. So maybe from the perspective of analyzing and thinking about this data and how we approach this data and how we actually find this kind of data and make sure that we're using reusable data. So I like to look at it from a kind of risk perspective of using that data and the unplannedness and so on. So I will start probably from trying to get a loop and making sure that we actually have a proprietary data set to go on first, because this is the least risky one. This is the one that provides you the most control and potentially your competitive advantage. And then it would cascade towards things like open public data APIs, which would give you access to data that everybody else also has, so you might not have as much competitive advantage, but those are very reliable data sources. And then you would go down to more risky things like scraping, which is legal, by the way. Well, it depends. So, like, if you notice, like a couple of years ago, there was the LinkedIn kind of court case which got dismissed. So, public data is okay to scrape. And then we would go to more kind of risky things and try to think about, okay, what this data source is this data source reliable? Do we have a lot of replacement? Because hopefully, like data like weather data or satellite data would usually be very similar between companies, so we have a lot of redundancy there in choosing the data supplier. And finally, we'll go and purchase data from a third-party provider. That's might be the most risky approach to this, but it can also be the most valuable approach to this. Might be the most valuable data. So, yeah, hopefully it addressed the question.
Yeah, no, that definitely does. And a lot of this actually starts getting me thinking about things like de-identification and personally identifiable information and how we're addressing that. So I'm going to flip to Lloyd to talk a little bit about legal and regulatory factors that we need to think about. There's been a lot of chatter around California Consumer Privacy Act and GDPR, and what do we as organizations who are looking to integrate alternative data need to take into account?
Well, it's good news that scraping is legal, or I would be in a lot of trouble. I think the big question right now that we're all looking for clarity on is, in fact, the future of open banking, or rather consumer-directed finance here in Canada. As I'm sure everybody here is aware, we just recently saw the report from the Advisory Committee on Open Banking. And the good news was that made it clear that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I know we're looking really forward to working with them in the second stage of their findings. We think that ultimately the eventual regulation in Canada of this industry it's going to be a positive. We need to have all the different players involved in the process and participating in it so that we come up with the best possible outcome for everyone.
Okay, excellent, thank you. I'm going to go back to a point that Gene actually brought up with respect to data sourcing, whether that's third party that's coming in from an internal source or otherwise. You've all come up with new products. You've been iterating on existing products. Start with Borrowell. Borrowell's beta launched Borrowell Boost today that uses AI-based predictive technology to scan customers' spending patterns to determine when their bills are actually due. Clearbanc uses AI-powered diligence process that you're constantly refining to, and VFS offering new tools in the SME space. As you identify new opportunities in the market, how are you going about sourcing the new data sets that you need in order to run those? Or is it actually flipped backwards, the process? Is one informing the other? Are you generating that data exclusively internally? Are you working with third-party data vendors? What does that process look like? I'll start with Tanay.
Sure. There is, so accessing new types of data, it's like you don't know what's going to correlate with what. So I think what you brought up about access to public data is really understanding the primary data of your sample in context of the population. So there's a lot of publicly available data that you can use to get a better understanding of what your sample looks like. As far as kind of like new data inputs and signals, one thing that we focus on, so I run product, I'm not a data scientist, I work a lot with data science, so it's how do we unblock them and how do we make them way more efficient. So I think it's setting up the scalable tools and basically to allow them to iterate a lot faster. So if, for instance, someone on our diligence or operations team finds a signal in the data, it could be anything from like number of NSFs to hey, like this person is eating out at McDonald's every single day. Like, is that a correlation, right? So you don't know. So setting up the data platform and the backtesting infrastructure to basically let our data science team run free and solve the problems and investigate the problems that they might think there's a correlation is probably the most important thing that we can work on. So you never know where the signals are gonna come from, but if you set up the right infrastructure and hire the right people, and somebody brought up human capital in the last platform, it is about like creativity and like how you draw signals from the noise. So setting up the right backtesting and infrastructure layer to allow our data scientists to be more efficient is probably the most important thing that we're focused on at Clearbanc as well.
Great. So?
Yeah, I want to talk about sourcing data internally, as in you just have this new data source and now you need to transform it into something that's useful. And you can call that feature engineering. I think we've already touched on the difficulty of turning this really rich data set into something that's actually usable. When Tanay talks about setting up data infrastructure, I think of the importance of data engineering and then having a pipeline to be able to take that transaction data and store it in some kind of centralized data warehouse that's actually usable by analytics teams. I think there's a ton of hype around hiring data scientists, but I think a precursor to that is hiring good data engineers, because otherwise your data scientists end up doing mostly data engineering. Once you have this infrastructure in place, I think feature engineering is really kind of this iterative process between hypothesis testing and then doing the diligent cleaning. So for instance, if you have a hypothesis about, this kind of feature is going to be important, you create it, you test it. If it doesn't work, you keep iterating on that. So feature engineering is definitely a creative and time-consuming process, but it's what we need to do to ultimately get that data into something that's usable for modeling.
Yeah, I agree. We spend a lot more time just on the cleaning and normalizing of the data than we actually do on the data science side. And in fact, that's probably the core, that is the core of our business now, is just working on how to clean that data so that our data science team can actually have fun with it.
I think on top of the cleaning thing, there's another thing, an underlying issue actually. So alternative data is usually a lot weaker than traditional data. So like bureau data mixed together in the same model with alternative data will probably kill off all the alternative data features. So I like making models that have a kind of wider understanding about the world because, they can understand the world better, they can imitate it better. But there's this kind of disconnect between using those features that will disappear in the model will be trained basically only on bureau data or credit data. So kind of how do you mitigate this? How do you mix in different models that are using each one maybe is using a kind of separate data set, and then how do you weigh them, how do you connect them? So this is something, an ongoing thing for us, so yeah.
Yeah, that's actually one of the follow-up questions that I had. So when you're evaluating a variety of different alternative data sets, some of them, they're never going to have one-for-one history. Some of them are going to be spotty, the way that they're connected will be different. Let's say in the context of a Clearbanc, for instance, we're looking at restaurants, we're interested in, let's say, hypothetically, Yelp review data. How do you think about the authenticity of that data? How do you think about the number of data points and the predictive power of that versus other data sets that you already have? And how do you kind of weigh those one against each other? I'm sure that's a challenge that all of you deal with because of the asymmetry in data quality.
Yeah, so access to pipeline predictability for your data is one issue, and I think that's some of the ways that we're going with open banking. Having access to a predictable pipeline of data sources is probably the best thing you can do to encourage innovation, because sometimes you don't even know the use cases that they'll unlock. Clearbanc in particular focuses on, so it might not be the best panel, but like we focused on primary data sources rather than like alternative data sources. So we are always looking at ways to kind of like use alternative data like social and things like that to provide more context, but a large majority of our underwriting models rely on sort of like immutable data. So think if a business processes a transaction using Stripe, even if they want to go in and alter that transaction, they can't. So that's why it's a higher trust, higher transparency into the business. So you need to vary the confidence of your of the data source that you're looking at based on the trust that you have in sort of like the data pipeline. So scraping data sources is extremely hard to draw, one, because there's no predictability into that, and also if it's not normalized in a way. So we focus a lot more on the immutable primary data sources, and then also leverage sort of social data sources and other alternative data sources, but those have lower confidence and lower weights in our model, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think in terms of trusting a new data set, what's really important is the exploration phase beforehand. I think that you need to really put in the time to understand the covariance structure between a new feature and the features that you already have in the model. I think I want to contrast that with a trend in the data science field right now, which is towards more automation. And these kind of automated machine learning, auto ML frameworks are becoming really commonplace. And I think there's a lot of power to that. They can save you a lot of time when you're dealing with data that you're familiar with. And they also work to democratize data science to people who aren't data scientists. But when it comes to a brand new feature or a brand new area of data that you're not familiar with, you really have to kind of cast away the automation and really understand the statistical structure of that relative to the features you already have.
Thanks. So taking it back to one of the questions that we had from the audience at the end of the last panel, let's talk a little bit about the risks of using alternative data in your models. So we've seen with the acquisition of Plaid by Visa, and if rumor mills are anything to go by, we can probably expect more of such acquisitions from incumbents in the market. That's probably going to affect the way that data is consumed from Plaid. And we've seen similar situations where, let's say in the context of the web browsing history was mentioned earlier, we had JumpShot, a company that was suspended because of privacy practices, and then trickle-down effect on a variety of other companies that were sourcing web browsing history. If you had models that were hinged on that or incorporated that by any means, what are your contingency plans to address that when suddenly a risk like this comes up and it shuts down, you no longer have that pipeline? Sol, do you want to start?
Sure. I'll talk about it less from the legal regulatory standpoint and more, how can you focus your model building to protect yourself against, for instance, a regulatory change? I think the focus has to be on setting aside time explicitly to focus on model interpretability. I think there's a lot of tools today to be able to build really powerful models that pass validation, they work in production, and you don't really know how they're making their decisions. I think that if you kind of focus on interpretability as well as predictive accuracy, then you kind of have this in your back pocket to protect yourself. I think part of the focus on predictive accuracy also comes from the data science community and this idea of online machine learning competitions like Kaggle that really just prioritize accuracy. But in the real world, we also have to understand why our models are making those decisions.
Gene, did you want to add
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, I gave the framework before of decreasing risk, but I think when you mentioned what kind of contingency plan you have, I think the first and most important thing from what I observe is to actually have a contingency plan, to actively go out and look for alternatives. So, from my personal experience, I had a startup that actually failed because we didn't have a contingency plan just like that. We were dependent on a lot of third-party data. We didn't go and proactively look for additional data sources, maybe replace entirely the data that we're purchasing. So I think building this and allocating time to that is really important because a lot of data science teams don't bother doing that because we just want to move forward and do modeling.
All right, so now talking a little bit about your teams themselves, let's talk a bit about the infrastructure that's required to actually support alternate data onboarding, exploration, vetting, and then actual integration. And I'll start with you, Tanay. So we mentioned data engineers, we mentioned data scientists. Can you walk through the flow a little bit, where it starts, all the people sort of involved in the process before it actually getting ingested into the research?
Yeah, for sure. So totally echo what Saul said, investing in data platform versus data science is probably the most important thing that we can focus on so that they can do a lot faster. And setting up your infrastructure for scalability is probably the most important thing that we look for. We run data science sprints. So we have a data science team, a data platform team, and we have a data sort of product manager in some ways. I don't know if that's the right term for it. but like he basically translates business priority to the data science team. So the worst thing you can do with the data science team is be prescriptive of how they should solve a problem versus giving them the expectation of what the business context looks like and the problem that that they need to solve, and then sort of like allowing them to run free and figure out the right ways to do it. So we have sort of like a product manager who sets the business priority for the data science team, works with our head of data science to prioritize some of those problems. But then one thing we tried to do in the past that I guess didn't work really well is put data science on 2-week sprints, like the engineering team, which did not work at all because like they need more room to run, and you need to have accountability. But you also, if you confine creativity to 2 weeks and you're like, hey, here's a deadline, you better deliver something, and you'll get like 1%, 1.5% incremental improvements week over week. So really the focus there is we give our data science team larger business context on problems that needs to be solved, give them the freedom to run and kind of like be creative in how they solve those problems, and then also pair them with a data platform team to help them to quickly test and iterate their models using new types of data, existing types of data, connect them with the right internal teams, like, for instance, our payments team. If we're seeing problems with someone with repaying us based on our revenue share agreement, those are signals that we take very seriously and are communicated directly to data science, but how they use it is totally up to them. So that's kind of like our structure at Clearbanc.
Yeah, our experience closely echoes that. Our actual data science guys are largely autonomous, so they can look at the bigger picture, take longer exploring it, whereas the rest of our team, say if they're working on the other 2 stages of the pipeline, like bringing the data in and normalizing the data, that's more traditionally structured in 2-week sprints. But the data science guys, no, they've got free run.
Mm-hmm. And Gina, given that Mark mentioned that you're looking to expand your data science capabilities here.
Absolutely. So first of all, we're actively hiring. We're trying to invest as much as possible into and we're addressing a very wide array of problems and probably tapping into almost every vein of machine learning models. So we're solving interesting things. And about what the guy just said, actually, I do exactly the opposite. So I find that 2 sprints are actually very useful, and as long as they're using soft time commitments and as long as the process is adjusted, I don't see a big difference between machine learning teams and general engineering teams in that sense, because we're still in the business context and we're still trying to get results and eventually make money or change the world or whatever the objective is.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I think just to summarize some of the key themes that came across here in terms of how to use alternative data, when to use it, there's a lot of creativity involved. There's a lot of testing, research, due diligence, and clearly on this panel itself, we've got different approaches and some similarities to how it's evaluated as well. I want to leave the session by asking you all what the North Star might actually be for each of you when it comes to alternative data sets and AI-driven models. So you probably wouldn't disclose this, but if there was, an ideal state for alternative data, a specific data set type, hypothetically, or a state of automation, whether that's full, AutoML or otherwise, what does that state look like? And I'll start with you, Gene, this way.
Cool. Okay, so I'll take a step back and way back to the Big Bang, the creation of the universe. So there are 4 forces in science and physics that drive everything, and scientists currently physicists trying to unify them into one force. So maybe the same kind of thing could happen in machine learning, where we would unify everything, hopefully, in using neural networks, because they're kind of producing the best functions, and they allow to build a lot with one framework, you could address everything altogether. The only problem there is that interpretability of neural networks. There's a problem, and this is why in the industry that a lot of us have to resort to, or logistic regression, like I said before, tree-based models and things like that. I think that there's a lot of work being done right now. I don't think I know. There's a lot of work being done right now into making neural nets less of a black box. And last year there was a lot of things already discovered in how making recommendation engines with neural nets more explainable, more understandable. So as long as this work progresses, I'm really excited about that. And I think that this would enable us to actually using one unified way of solving all the problems in the financial space and many other spaces as well.
So, all right, neural nets. Okay, Lloyd?
Explainability.
Yeah.
100%. It's explainability. We have some relatively crude tools right now so that we can see how like our risk score was arrived at, but there's still a long way to go to get that better, and that's something that we're actively working on, and definitely that's our North Star.
Okay, great. Thanks.
All right, so Gene already gave a very poetic discourse on unification. I'll come at it from what excites me most about alternative data is diversification through being creative about it. I think it really has the potential to really diversify our field in a really healthy way. So like the example is, I think every lender uses some flavor of credit score, utilization, debt service. But once we move to alternative data, the creativity and being able to apply kind of experimentation to it could lead to a field where lots of lenders are using features that other lenders are not necessarily using. Of course, we still have to abide by being careful and abiding by regulations, but I think being creative and treating it partially as an art form, at least in the early stages, is something that excites me a lot.
Yeah, I completely agree with Lloyd about sort of the explainability and quick iteration, so you can explain. I think data science is one tool in kind of like your workshop to be able to solve sort of like larger overarching business problems. And I think the biggest issue is like having this black box where, you know, like having this overarching machine learning model where it's like, hey, don't ask questions, just kind of like trust the model. That's not going to fly in the coming future. So it's kind of like, how do we explain the models? How do we bring more transparency to what data science is working on so that it can be used, it can be leveraged as a tool to solve pretty hard problems and is not sort of treated as like this black box, which has no accountability or predictability on what we can expect as an output.
All right, excellent. So with those very poetic expressions of what we're looking for in the future, steering away from black boxes, I'm going to open up the floor to a couple of questions. So does anyone have a question for you?
Hi there, my name is Jerry. So just a quick question for everyone, because everyone talks about explainability. So I'm kind of curious, in all of your companies, is there anyone that's specifically focused on attribution of the model and trying to explain it? Is that a specific role, or that's something that the product owner takes on?
So I'd say everybody's role is to do that and make sure that things are explainable or as explainable as possible. So I wouldn't say that I don't see necessarily a necessity of getting a specific role to do that. Maybe in a larger organization there is a need, I don't know the use cases, but I think everybody should have in the back of their mind the explainability anyway.
Yeah, it's something that our data science team like currently works on and continues to work on as part of their role.
Yeah, for us, it's not a separate role. It is up to the individual. The demands of it also depend on the specific model. So if we have an underwriting model, the explainability of that is much more important than, let's say, our recommendations engine. But the person building the recommendations engine still needs to be able to explain those decisions.
Yeah, and also having right now explainable, like our models get greenlit by sort of like a 180-day holdout sample and backtesting on historical data that we have through our portfolio, but also like setting up that tight feedback loop between the right stakeholder. It could be your chief risk officer, who is basically tracking the progress of your models in real time and feeding that back into data science so that they can either decommission, rework certain models, because what everyone knows, like, if it works in a test environment and sort of like backtesting, that doesn't mean it's going to hold up with the exact same samples in production. So having that another way to kind of like bring light to what data science is working on is to have a very tight feedback loop into actual real-time performance of the models and feeding that input back into our kind of like data science team. One example of that is kind of like a risk manager who's tracking the performance of our models against our prediction and underwriting engines.
This was actually an interesting challenge for us since we're not a lender ourselves. We had to establish the very, very close relationships with clients of ours so that we could get those feedback loops to see, what we've designed in a lab and tested in a lab, does it actually work in real life? And fortunately, we have been able to do that. And we are able to track it over time and improve, but it's going to continue to be a challenge in the future as we, build optimized models for different sectors.
Okay, this question here. What alt data sets you wish you had access to? What would be your top data sets?
For me, I would love to see the actual customer profile information from the loan application, since we don't have any access to that information right now. We've done some early tests with that type of demographic or just everything from the application we don't get right now, but I think that when we can get that will be a huge bonus for us.
I think that what Mark said before about mobile data, so basically I'd like to know everything about you.
Yeah, I definitely echo that sentiment, but also on full picture digital exhaust data, I think it's super difficult to work with anything that's kind of cookie based, but I'd love to have that.
Yeah, and then sort of like for us, it's also fraud detection tools right now, like globally, sort of like RegTech and like fraud detection for companies. We're focused a little more on companies, but like companies and like bringing light to the true stakeholders in the business and what their histories look like. Right now, anyone can open up a business very quickly. It's easier to sign up for a business than a library card. So really understanding like who is behind the businesses, what their histories have been like, and because if let's say you had a business that failed, like 5 businesses that failed miserably, once you start a new one, it's really hard to actually get the history of the directors and associated operators. So better pipes into kind of like databases associated with regulatory and fraud would be really interesting.
Just a quick question: when you purchase third-party data or when you source data from vendors, how do you measure your ROI, or how do you price these things? How do you think about you're getting a fair price for these sets, and how do you measure the success or returns on these things?
It's tough, but it's sort of like, because you need to access a significant amount of data to kind of like test the inputs. But if you run multiple models in production, you can see which ones are actually using it. But at our core, we're sort of like data science, and that's where we spend the capital most aggressively. So short-term ROI into acts, we want to kind of be able to 360-degree view of our customers. Even if the immediate ROI is not transparent to us, it's worth the investment, because once you have access to that data, you never know when that kind of like spark of creativity will sort of fly. And you don't want to go get the data after that. You want to make it available to people so that they can be creative and figure out how to use it.
Yeah, I think as Tanay kind of mentioned, it's a bit of chicken and egg, because it's like you want to make the case that getting this data is going to be really valuable, but you can't make the case because you don't have the data yet. So I think you just have to do the best you can. You have to try to find similar examples in the history of your business, look at what other businesses are doing, try to make that case, and then do as much testing as you can.
So yeah, absolutely agree. So I think you just have to go with it and see what happens, especially in the early days when you're just building things up, which is the case for us. You don't have the luxury of choosing, and you don't have a track record of tracking ROI. So this is something, capability that we would need to build, and I imagine a lot of other teams also.
Yeah, question over here. So you guys obviously have a ton of experience and a ton of knowledge. I'm curious, as a consultant, I've worked with a lot of the big banks here in Canada. They have a ton of challenges with legacy migration, legacy data, all of that. Let's use the example of, let's say we're starting a net new bank here in Canada, and we're looking at creating a data hub or a data platform in order to enable, advanced analytics, data science, all of that comes after. Can you just give me a brief description of what you would classify as kind of like a cutting edge technology stack, and maybe some brief kind of operational framework? What does the ideal data hub for a bank look like to you guys?
That doesn't sound theoretical. That sounds like you're asking something very concrete.
Maybe. I'm not going to say yes or no.
I guess I don't have a good answer for this.
I think one game changer for us has been kind of separating a production pipeline for data and an analytics pipeline. I think the one thing I'll say about that is, let's say you have 2 databases. The production database, if it operates in real time, it's optimized for a single record retrieval. The analytics database is optimized not for that, but for doing massive aggregations. So that's the first thing, is you need to separate the data that's running your software and the data that's used for offline analytics that's going to power the next version of your software. I think one more recommendation I would make is investing in some sort of machine learning lifecycle management platform. I think a big challenge in data science is it's hard to reproduce the exact conditions that a model was trained on. And so if you can kind of tie a data set version to perhaps a query, to a training run, to a model, that can be very powerful, especially if you invest in that early.
Yeah, and also if like really like the focus, there's two schools of thoughts and like how this is going to happen. There's one example, which is someone like Cross River, who's gone to a fully licensed bank, which is technology first, building APIs from scratch, and they have direct relationships with the fintechs, but they own the entire kind of like technology stack. So they build the APIs, but to your point about like what's the most important is predictable, reliable API access through a fire hose that we can kind of like input in a way that's reliable. And then if you're thinking about like, you know, whether you need to start a bank or not, the other school of thought is there are existing regulated banks like Evolve and things like that. But what you have companies like Synapsify who are building a technology layer over that to build a predictable pipelines into those companies. So it's like, how do you think through whether you want to be the technology layer over a bank and leverage the licenses versus like build a bank from scratch? Both have merits. We'll see which one plays out.
I would also add a monitoring system. I think it's an important thing that a lot of time being neglected, kind of. So I think about those as well.
Yeah, a question for Lloyd actually. Earlier you mentioned you'd want to get access to sort of more profile information early on the piece. How do you ensure that you automate that collection so that you're not seeing like drop off in application rates, that sort of thing?
Well, we would just make sure that there was just all API based so that when the initial request is sent to us, they would include all of that profile information as well. And then we could just take it from there. The challenge really is just having that level of comfort with our clients that they're happy and, you know, confident that they legally can share that data with us. They're already going to have collected it at that point.
So on the topic of mutability of data, there's certain data which is unchangeable, and there's certain data which is interpretable or generated by people. For example, in private equity, you might have financial statements that are generated by accountants. How are those mutable data treated? Like, what's the process making it standardized or consumable for a credit model?
Yeah, so with the sort of immutable data, we talk about like sort of the raw data dump from something like a payment processor, which you can change if you want, so that we have extremely high confidence in the veracity of that sort of like data set. And then you sort of have immutable data, which not kind of like self-reported compiled data, which you will have lower trust in, but then you need to figure out how to normalize it. So there's interesting companies out there, like everyone kind of reconciles accounting differently. There are plaids for accounting, so they'll normalize your data pipeline for like your QuickBooks Xero, so then someone like us can just plug into one of those systems and get our normalized data pipeline. But for immutable higher trust, there's still value in sort of like self-reported data and compiled data, but now you have the problem of like, is there a standardized way of looking at it, or do you need to go one step further, clean the data and normalize it for your use case based on, because everyone kind of compiles it a little bit differently.
So a question for you, Nikita. Very curious how CPBIB is currently using alternative data, and if you can talk about one cool use case.
So I can talk very high level about it. About a couple of years ago, we started looking at a variety of different alternative data sets and how that can be integrated into both discretionary research, so think very stock company specific, as well as quantitative research, where we have systematic investment factor-based models over the years with core fundamental financial data powering those, and we're trying to identify the strength and power of a variety of different alternative data sets. So think of your quintessential types in terms of exploring social data, integrating some sort of economic data into that. A variety of different data sets. And it really depends on the geography that we're looking to analyze an investment in. If it's due diligence for private equity deals, it can be very, very niche cuts of data. So they're typically not available from commercial alternative data vendors. It's something that really have to go out and procure otherwise. But yeah, generally, there's a large commercial alternative data industry that exists right now. Hundreds and hundreds of vendors based around the world collecting data in a variety of different jurisdictions, and we focus a lot of time and effort in building expertise and understanding data across geographies and sectors. So yeah, really just depends on what we're trying to drive and whether we see potential for alpha from those cases. Any other questions?
I think there's a question down
One,
there.
yeah, got one in the back, okay.
I'm keeping everyone's time here, so I'm going to try to make this easier question. I want to tie it back to the business case. By the way, my name is Mark. So tying it back to business lending, from what I've heard from the two panels so far, there's a lot of talk about evaluating the owner's creditworthiness and has been less focused on the business itself. What I mean by that is if we're looking at a public company, you wouldn't say, oh, the CEO pays the bills on time, so the company performs well. You would then look at the MD&A or all the financial statements because it's public. Everything's available online. And that information is also available for private companies. It's just that nobody has requested that or nobody has, I guess, authorized access to that unless there's a connection there. So my question is there any effort or any sort of demand to try to understand the business as a whole from a 360 perspective and what's in its funnel, sort of like if you look at SNC's report, you see that they have projects upcoming in various locations around the world. If the private company, if you can see that from them, would that information be valuable? And if there was a data provider, would you guys want to work with them?
Yeah, preach. That's exactly what we're kind of like focused on because we actually don't pull the operators' credit scores and we don't require personal guarantees from our credit providers. We think FICO is outdated. It takes a long time to recover from. An example is our co-founder Michelle, who's on Dragon's Den. Her credit score took a hit because of a PayPal account that she signed up for 10 years ago to process payments on another company that she built, which was Bytopia. If you sign up for a payment processor, you are personally liable for refunds used on the payment processor and missed payments. So if something was to go wrong and that your credit score was to take a dip, and people were like, hey, why is your credit score low? I don't think you qualify for better funding, even though you built a multi-million-dollar business. Our focus is we think FICO is outdated, especially for business credit. But the problem is there isn't a true business credit score. So in some ways, what you want to do is if you do this right and you evaluate the right data sources from the company and in context of the market, what you could do is sort of like reinvent credit scores for businesses, and that would be extremely valuable and kind of you could become like a rating agency. But our focus is not on the entrepreneur, but rather the entrepreneur's ability to operate a business and what they've shown in the past.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for the great questions and for being so engaged. I think some of us might stick around for a couple minutes. If anyone else has any other questions after,